There's an aesthetic idea that ugly and beautiful are not value judgments. They say nothing about the quality of the works they describe. To be ugly is, in the simplest sense, to be visually unpleasant, and that displeasure can be in service of artistic ends, which create a worthwhile experience because of, rather than in spite of, said displeasure. Applying this idea to film can be difficult, however, as displeasure in this medium often entails discomfort beyond just the visual dimension which ugliness implies. This is exhibited by The Killing of a Sacred Deer, a 2017 film which is characterized by profound displeasure, presented in the film through scope far beyond just visual. Examining the individual facets of how the unpleasant is cultivated in this film requires a consideration for how the ways these facets interact is essential to the creation of an unsettling atmosphere. Part of what makes ugly a word which fails to capture the scope of displeasure as it applies to film viewing comes from how that displeasure is cultivated by the interactions between different elements of film form in a way which is unique to said form. The displeasure of individual elements can only properly be understood within a holistic vision of how the film is generally unsettling, and how these individual elements contribute to that, rather than a view of them as unpleasant in and of themselves. Keeping that in mind, the cultivation of the unsettling can be seen from the first frame of the film. The grotesque, pulsating image of a human heart emerges from darkness as the premier visual, and the dialogue exchange which follows this surgery is as unsettling. The stilted writing and delivery of otherwise mundane small talk makes this simple conversation feel alienating and grating. As subsequent exchanges take shape, the idiosyncratic tension of this strange dialogue is built on even more. Static shots are given unresolved tension, replaced with slow zooms, which give even the dullest conversations a sense of artifice, which hints at impending doom. This is supplemented with the shrill score, whose dragged-out high pitches lend further anxiety to the nothingness of the early plot. Relationships such as that between Stephen and Martin are introduced by these techniques, but the clear peculiarities of such relationships remain just that, peculiarities. The unsettling ways the characters interact with one another is the status quo, and the film takes its time establishing this in the 50-minute first act. That is not to say that these early scenes convey nothing important. The opposite is the case, with elements such as Stephen's previous struggles with alcoholism and accountability for Martin's father's death being stealthily established. Alongside this, we see him lying about all of this to his family and friends. The exposition does not supersede the immediate affect of nothingness which permeates early scenes, however, and this is mirrored by the mise-en-scène, with drab shades of gray drenching sets and costuming which are largely realistic but fail to be evocative in any way. The lack of any event of consequence taking place in these drab environments ultimately makes the first act one which fosters disgust in the ways it defiles elements typical of such a segment of a film. It presents the status quo upon which the subsequent acts will build, but that status quo is deeply uncomfortable, and the refusal to incite the story for such a long period of time under these misshapen circumstances makes the impact of such malformities even more impactful. In a sense, uglier. The transition into the second act is foretold as Bob begins to feel unwell, and his early symptoms are ushered in by a transition in the score, screeching high pitches replaced with ominous, pulsating bass. The early stages of his unwellness, however, are still little more than foreboding, and no conflict has emerged. This changes when Stephen meets with Martin in the hospital cafeteria. Martin gives Stephen a gift, a Swiss Army knife, alongside an ultimatum. Stephen must kill one of his family members in order to atone for his killing of Martin's father. There is nothing adversarial about the way Martin delivers this information to Stephen, and later events will show he is unable to understand why they should interfere with their relationship at all. This may be the initial incident, but it is carefully organized as to offer little that fulfills what is expected of such a plot development, further making the narrative difficult to engage with. The second act which follows is made up not of attempts to remedy the situation, as would usually be the case, but instead of attempts to deny that any situation exists at all. Stephen places greater and greater misguided trust in empiricism as the many tests he runs become more and more contradictory with easily observable reality. His attempts to prove that nothing is wrong grow to take on a more sinister character as time passes, attempting to force his son to eat and later walk in intensely uncomfortable sequences. This discomfort is made even more poignant by sporadic moments of comedy which only heighten the lengths to which Stephen's denial is mortifying to observe. Slapstick, such as Bob being dropped multiple times, Stephen's hyperbolic threat to make him eat his hair, and Stephen's freak-out in the kitchen are all moments which are paced shot in time for comedic effect. But this humor is not pleasant. As funny as these moments are, there is little about how humor is presented which makes it satisfying, leading it to only more profoundly accent the mangled and disproportionate character of how the second act is presented, defined by a sluggish inactivity which perverts the ways films typically approach finality in their midsection. Ushering in the third act is a scene of particular intensity which also helps to illustrate the purposeful nature of the unpleasant elements of the film. This scene is a confrontation with Martin, which takes place in Stephen's basement. Martin illustrates his idea of justice, biting first Stephen's arm and then his own, in order to justly punish himself. This exchange is one of the most unsightly of the film, and the unsettling imagery is coincided by an overpowering and guttural swell in the score. Additionally, Martin remarks on the metaphorical nature of this action as far as it explains his vision of justice.
Do you understand? It's metaphorical. My example, it's a metaphor.
This line, in addition to informing how both Stephen and the audience view Martin as mentally unstable, also serves as indicative of how the film itself communicates ideas. Just like Martin's actions, the story itself is metaphorical. And as Martin forces us to grapple with the disturbed nature of his actions, he too forces us to recognize that these actions must be abstracted onto the world around us. That disgust with him is disgust with the societal elements he represents. This point in the film is one the thematic significance of ugliness therein hinges on. Martin, at his most manically grotesque, analogically projects himself upon the world in an act which, through horrific literal nature, presents metaphorical significance which cannot be ignored. While this sequence ushers in the third act, it is not itself the final confrontation. Rather, this exchange with Martin forces Stephen and his family to confront the real horror, the impossible problem which Martin has thrust upon them. At this point, Stephen truly realizes for the first time that he is going to have to kill a member of his family, and they simultaneously realize that one of them must die. This realization does not lead to immediate action, however, and before the final commitment is made, the relationships in the family dissolve from strenuous to transactional. Actions which might seem loving in other contexts are cynical ploys to gain favor with Stephen, and we see every member of the family attempting to flatter him, implicitly attempting to doom the rest. When Stephen finally does decide to commit the deed, it is a moment of cruel irony. His infantile attempt to exonerate himself, an image which imbues the intense imagery of an executioner, into a childly humorous portrayal of his inability to cope. Displeasure is on the face of what defines viewing the film. The atmosphere created by the uncomfortable dialogue, sterile mise-en-scène, and piercing score are a carpet upon which a misshapenly paced story is told, and there is nothing offered which can maintain interest in an audience simply seeking entertainment. As pointed out by Martin, however, it is all metaphorical. The very elements which make the film so unpleasant to view allow it to so pointedly address a reality which is equally disgusting in the eyes of the film. Being formally organized around an affect which lends itself only to unease and disgust makes for an instrument of succinct social criticism, particularly because unease and disgust are so central to how social ills are metaphorically understood through the film. Ugly is a word whose dimension is incongruent with the overwhelming unease which permeates the sensory experience the film provides. Even so, the film is exemplary of ugliness in the aesthetic sense throughout, an experience unpleasant in such a productive and rewarding way that it is impossible to look away from.